So 4.5 gives us a chance to roll it all together. And 4.5 is that kind of mixing bowl with all of the different polynomials thrown in it. And you have to decide how to factor things. And so 4.5 gives us a bit of some tips or a chance to practice our factoring strategies. Now, these methods are written down sort of always like little notes here. I like to see it as a bit of a decision-making tree or a flow chart. So off the top, anytime I see a polynomial that I'm supposed to factor, I'm going to start off by looking for the greatest common factor. And the reason I do that is that it's going to knock the numbers down. You could greatest common factor at the end if you miss it off the top, but you're going to be left in the meantime in a world of really big numbers. And so start off with looking for a greatest common factor each and every time. I have to admit that I miss that step and then I'm like, have to fix it at the end. So greatest common factor is always what you should try first. After greatest common factor, we're going to take a look at how many terms there are there because we have different strategies for the different terms. And we worked through this material in this chapter with these in mind. So if we had 4 terms, we were going to factor by grouping. And that's where I put in those funky little brackets to just group them and look at just 2 terms at a time. That was also where I wanted to have that common binomial factor and factor that out. So after that, we actually utilize the factoring by grouping in the 3-term strategy. And so the 3-term strategy was what we covered in 4.1 and in 4.2. And in both cases, I said, let's do the AC test. So that was a little number puzzle where you'd write what the product of A and C was at the top and try and find the right factors that would add together to give you the B term. And so these are the 2 general forms for trinomials that we talked about. And these would be the simple ones where there was a 1 in that spot. And so the ones, or those simple ones, you could use the shortcut. But most of us are pretty hesitant to use the shortcut, hopefully because you took my advice in that sometimes you can't use the shortcut. And so the long cut, the AC test, works in both of these kinds of trinomials. And so that's what we had as our strategy for 3 terms, the AC test. After that, we took a look at polynomials that had 2 terms. And we said that if there are 2 terms, try and take a look at it and see if it fits the difference of squares pattern. And so the difference of squares pattern had a perfect square and a perfect square and a minus sign in between. And that fit that pattern that a squared minus b squared would equal a plus b and a minus b. And after that, we did have those optional topics in 4.4. They do technically have 2 terms, but we're going to simplify our approach to factoring and say that if you see 2 terms, you only need to consider the difference of squares. The sum of cubes and the difference of cubes is something that's going to come back to you in Math 50. So that's the general strategies for factoring. Again, greatest common factor, and then taking a look at how many terms you see. And hopefully at this point, these sketchy little notes make some sense to you. We're going to go through these ones and attack them to see if we can factor them as we go. And in class, it might be worth me just pausing the video here to let you just kind of give some of them a shot on your own, because at this point, you've probably seen me do enough of these, and this is where you really need to test yourself. So for A, when I take a look at A, I see that there is a 9 common to all of them. So I would write down my greatest common factor, and I'm going to fill up the brackets up with what's left over when I divide that common factor out. I'm preserving the value of this. So each of these, whoops, sorry, that's a 2. Each of these would then allow me to reverse engineer these, if you remember. So now I have my trinomial greatest common factored. And now I can take a look at the trinomial to see if it passes the AC test. You could have done the AC test with 9 times negative 72 at the top of your number puzzle, but that would be the world of pain that I'm saying avoid, and greatest common factor first. So once I've taken the 9 out, the number at the top of my number puzzle is a negative 8. I factor 8 in as many ways as I can. I know I have a negative 8, so that's that mismatch thing. I see that I have a negative b term, and so that means that my larger factors are going to be negative. And usually partway through there, I can see the values that decompose that middle term. I'm not going to use the shortcut in this. In chapter 5, I do start using the shortcut, but just to support us, the 9 is going to stay part of the party. So if you want to just circle it and say, okay, you'll come down in a minute. I recopy the first term. I expand that middle term, and I copy the last term. Now that I have it is 4 terms, I can slow it down and look at 2 terms at a time for factoring by grouping. And so I'd have an x common to these 2 terms, and factoring that out, I'd be left with an x and a plus 2 in the brackets. And again, that's showing my work would look like that, right? Then I take a look at the second 2 terms, and I can see the negative sign sticking out the front. So I can see that it's a negative 4 that would be the common factor of those 2 terms. And dividing negative 4 out of each of the 2 terms, I'll be left with that x plus 2. And I just did it as I was working through this problem. The fact that these 2 brackets match is really, really awesome, because now that bracket is your greatest common factor. So always write down your greatest common factor. Then you're going to put down the brackets and fill those up with what's left over when you divide that greatest common factor out of each of the terms. And so I get to my final answer here, and I wouldn't want to forget the 9 out the front. B, if I take a look at this one, I would see 4 terms. I would check for greatest common factor, and there's nothing. So I'm going to employ my strategy of factoring by grouping because there are 4 terms. Taking a look at the first 2 terms, I have an x common to both of those. I'm going to skip some of the steps. On A, I showed everything. And factoring that out, I'd be left with an x minus 3. Then I turn my attention to the second 2 terms. And when I see the second 2 terms have a positive out the front, that means that my greatest common factor is going to be a positive value, and it's going to be a positive 2y, because both 2 and y are common to these second 2 terms. If I were to factor that out, and sometimes I show my work, sometimes I don't, I would be left with an x and a minus 3. And again, these brackets matching are what's really awesome about this, because now that bracket is your greatest common factor. And factoring that out, I'd be left with an x and a plus 2y. See if you gave this one a shot and now are listening to the answer, or you were just going to wing it. Anyway, maybe you're just listening through. I see that I have no greatest common factor between these 2, and I see that I have 2 terms. And so I would take a look at this to see if it fits the pattern of difference of squares. And difference of squares, I was looking for even exponents and perfect square coefficients. So 4 as the exponent on both of those variables is an even number, so that's good. And 81 is a perfect square. The square root of 81 is 9. And so that means that I can put down the 2 brackets, and one bracket's going to get the positive sign, one bracket's going to get the negative sign. I take the square root of both of these terms. So the square root of x to the 4th is x squared. And so that goes in the first place. And the square root of 81 y to the 4th is 9y squared. And so that goes in the second place. And everything you've done to this point is correct, but you're not done. You always need to kind of take a look at where you are and decide, is there anything else I can do? So greatest common factor off the top, and in these difference of squares, sometimes you can keep going. This is again a difference of squares. So I recopy that first binomial. There's nothing I can do with it. They are perfect squares, but it's a plus in between, so there's nothing I can do to factor it. The difference of squares over here, I'd put down the 2 brackets. One bracket's going to get positive, one's going to get negative, and I take the square root of both terms. So the square root of x squared is x, And the square root of 9y squared is 3y. And so now I have it fully factored. Difference of squares 2 times to make that one work. 3 more down at the bottom here. When I take a look at D, the first thing I'm going to do is see if there's a greatest common factor for all of these, and there is not. It is a trinomial, so that would push me into the AC test thinking. It's one of these ones where I have a value for my A value. And so I would have 6 at the top of my number puzzle, and factoring 6 in as many ways as possible, I'd have 1 and 6 and 2 and 3. This is that case where I have to look at my middle term. So I could have all positives or all negative factors to get my positive 6, but I have a positive 7. And so positive B term means that all my factors are going to be positive, and 1 and 6 are going to be what satisfy my number puzzle. So those are the values that are going to decompose my middle term. So I copy the 3x squared and I expand that 7x into plus x or plus 1x and plus 6x. Copy the 2, and now I've got this into 4 terms. So in the AC test, after I had my number puzzle and decomposed that middle term, now I factor by grouping. The first 2 terms, I can see that there is an x common to both of those, and so I'd write down the x, and then I'm going to fill those brackets up with what's left over when I divide that out. And so I'd have a 3x and a plus 1 in the brackets. I then turn my attention to the second 2 brackets and I see a positive sign sticking out the front there. I can see that I have a 2 that's common to both of those. And so I fill the brackets up by what's left over when I divide that out. So that'd be a 3x and a plus 1. My brackets now match, so that is the common factor of my 2 terms, so I write it down. And then again, I fill up the brackets with what's left over when I divide that out. So if I were to divide this out of each of the terms, you probably might not be showing your work at this point, I'd be left with the x and the plus 2 in the brackets. Remember these ones, you should be able to check your work. You should be able to FOIL them out and reverse engineer them back to the original question. Remember that on these ones where you have that coefficient, again, there's no shortcut. So you still utilize that number puzzle, but it's not the direct link to the answer like it is when you have the 1 in the A spot. If I take a look at E, again, I would take a look at it for greatest common factor first, and I don't see anything that's common to all those terms. Then I see how many terms I have, and I have 3 terms. So again, that's the AC test. This is not a simple trinomial because I have a 5 out the front. So that gives me A times C at the top of my number puzzle, so negative 15 at the top of my number puzzle. I'm going to factor 15. I'll come back to the signs. So it's factored in as many ways as I can. And now I have to take a look at the B term because I've got this mismatched thing. To get a negative 15, one factor has to be positive and the other one has to be negative. Because I have a positive middle term, that means the larger are going to be positive and the smaller are going to be negative. And that helps me decide which combination of factors satisfy my number puzzle because those two would add to a positive 2. So those are the 2 values that are going to decompose that middle term. If you're one of the people that has realized you can put these in either order and it still works, go for it. I'm going to do it the same as I've done all of them. Maybe somebody's listening going, what? So now I have 4 terms and I can factor by grouping. So I see an x common to the first 2 terms, and factoring that out, I'd be left with a 5x minus 3. And when I take a look at the second 2 terms, when I wrote them in this order, the only thing that is common to them is the factor of 1. And it's a positive 1 because that sign is sticking out the front. So that means that I'm going to be left with a 5x minus 3 in the bracket. That's all that happens when you divide each of those by 1. You rewrite that, but you do need that plus 1 in there because now we have the bracket as common, and what's left over would be the x plus 1. And this should be something that you can reverse back to the original question. One last one here, and there's so many of these in your notes. Give F a try, and then I'll talk through F. So F is a difference of squares. There's no greatest common factor between those. I dismissed it pretty quick when there's no coefficient out the front, but it is a difference of squares. So that means that it's going to fit this pattern. I've got even exponents, I've got perfect squares. I'm going to take the square root of the first term and put it in the first spot. And you take the square root of the second term and put it in the second spot. And hopefully you're getting wise to these. That again is another difference of squares. So this is a sum of squares, which is nothing in our books as far as factoring goes. But this fits the pattern again. So we have a positive and a negative. The square root of the first term would be AB, so that goes in the first spot. And the square root of 4 is 2, so that goes in the second spot. And now I have that fully factored. There's lots more we could try. There's lots in your homework, so I didn't do too many more of these. It is really important that you're solid on your factoring skills because we're going to use those as we move into solving equations in the next section, and then solving equations brings us to the word problems of chapter 4.